I've never been one to believe in the supernatural, ghost stories, haunted objects, urban legends. They always seem like fantasies, the kind of things people clung to for a cheap thrill. So when I bought the mirror, I wasn't thinking about anything other than how well it would fit in my bedroom. It was one of those dreary, endless afternoons when the sky seems permanently overcast. The rain had started that morning and didn't let up, casting the whole town in a damp, grey haze. I'd already finished everything on my to-do list, and I was restless, so I decided to go for a walk. My feet carried me aimlessly until I found myself on a street I hadn't remembered turning onto. I hadn't meant to stop by the antique shop. It was tucked away on a quiet street, half hidden between a closed bakery and a hardware store that seemed on the verge of closing. The sign was so faded you could barely make out the letters. Timeless treasures. But something about it called to me. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the idea of exploring a place filled with forgotten things. Either way, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The shop was dimly lit, cluttered with shelves of knickknacks and dusty furniture. The smell of old wood and aged paper was thick in the air, with a faint undertone of something metallic that I couldn't quite place. As I wandered through the narrow aisles, running my fingers over chipped vases and faded books, I felt strangely calm, like I'd stepped into a time capsule. That's when I saw it. The mirror was propped up against the back wall, almost hidden behind an old wooden cabinet. It wasn't large, just a bit taller than me, with a brass frame that had tarnished over the years. The design on the frame was intricate, swirling patterns that almost seemed to move if you stared at them too long. For a second, I thought it looked like veins, branching out like they were alive, crawling across the metal. But I blinked, and they were just designs again. I stood there for a long moment, staring at my reflection. I looked tired, probably from the rain. My hair frizzy around the edges, droplets of water still clinging to my jacket. But something else bothered me about the reflection. I couldn't put my finger on it. The owner, an elderly man with a worn apron and a permanent scowl, appeared beside me, startling me. "Good eye," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "That one's old. Been here a long time." "How long?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why it mattered. "Hard to say," he muttered, squinting at the mirror like he was seeing it for the first time. "Came in with a lot of stuff years back. Estate sale, I think. Belonged to some family that didn't leave much behind. People say it's got a certain charm." I chuckled, more out of politeness than anything else. Charm wasn't the word I would have used. Still, there was something compelling about it. Without thinking too much, I agreed to buy it. The price was surprisingly low, though I didn't question it. I got home late that evening, the rain still drizzling as I carried the mirror inside. It was heavier than it looked, and I had to drag it up the stairs to my bedroom, propping it against the wall above my dresser. Once I had it in place, I stood back to admire it. It looked perfect there, filling the empty space in my room like it had always belonged. That night, after a shower, I stood in front of the mirror again, wiping the steam from my face with a towel. There was something oddly satisfying about it, like finishing a puzzle you didn't even know you'd started. The mirror had this quality, an undeniable presence. I ran my fingers across its surface, tracing the faint etchings on the brass frame. My reflection stared back, hair damp, skin flushed from the heat of the shower. For a moment, I thought about the old man's words, about how long the mirror had been sitting there, how it must have seen countless other faces before mine. Days passed and life went on as usual. Work, errands, dinners with friends. Nothing seemed off. Nothing felt strange. Just a growing attachment to the mirror. I found myself drawn to it more than I expected, almost compulsively. Every morning I'd stand in front of it longer than necessary, fixing my hair, adjusting my clothes, catching fleeting glances of my reflection throughout the day. I started using it more often than the bathroom mirror, and sometimes I'd catch myself staring into it when I wasn't doing anything at all. It wasn't vanity, though. It felt like something deeper. There was an odd comfort in it, like the mirror was quietly observing me, reflecting me back to myself, but with an understanding, an awareness I couldn't quite explain. One evening, after an especially grueling day, I sat on the edge of my bed, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror and was startled by how worn out I appeared. I should have let it go, but something kept gnawing at me. It was in the back of my mind, subtle but persistent, like a splinter you can't quite pull out. I leaned forward, eyes narrowing as I studied the image in the mirror. And for the first time, I noticed something. Something small, but undeniable. My reflection's hand rested on the edge of the bed, just as mine did, but the angle was off. Slightly, almost imperceptibly. The fingers were splayed wider than my own, the wrist bent at a sharper angle. It was the kind of detail you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. But I saw it. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I shook my head, chalking it up to exhaustion. I must have been too tired, my mind playing tricks on me. With a weary sigh, I turned away and crawled into bed, letting sleep pull me under. The next morning, I tried to push the thought of the mirror from my mind. I went through my routine as usual, brushing my teeth, making breakfast, getting dressed for work. But something felt different, like a low hum of anxiety thrumming just below the surface. I told myself it was stress. Work had been demanding lately. I just needed rest, maybe a weekend away from everything. But still, I couldn't shake the creeping feeling that hung over me like a shadow. I wasn't sleeping well, and I knew why. I tried not to look at the mirror, but every time I passed by, whether it was on my way out of the bedroom or just in the periphery, my eyes would betray me. I'd steal a glance, quickly at first, just enough to confirm my reflection was still there, behaving as it should. But the more I avoided it, the stronger the compulsion became. One morning, as I was pulling on my coat, I caught myself staring again. Not for a second, not a passing glance, but really staring. It felt like being caught in a trance. My reflection holding my gaze in a way that was too intense, too knowing. My reflection blinked, perfectly in sync, but I hadn't blinked yet. The delay was so slight, almost unnoticeable, but there it was. I blinked again, testing it out, and she followed a fraction of a second after. My heart quickened, a surge of adrenaline flooding my chest. But I stayed put, rooted to the spot. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe I'd just imagined the timing was off. I stepped closer to the mirror, leaning in. My breath fogged up the glass for a moment. When it cleared, my reflection stood there, as it always did. Hair mussed, eyes tired. But there was something off. She looked like me, yes, but not quite me. Her expression was just a touch too relaxed, too composed, as if I was the one looking into her world, not the other way around. I tested it again, lifting my hand. My reflection followed instantly this time. I sighed, trying to let the tension drain away. "See?" I whispered to myself. "You're being ridiculous." But then it happened again. This time it wasn't a delay, it was a smile. Her lips curled upwards into the faintest smirk, while my own face remained still. The smile wasn't warm. It wasn't my smile. It was subtle, almost like she was amused by my confusion. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. "It's just stress." I repeated it like a mantra. "You're just tired." The rest of the day, I made a conscious effort to avoid the mirror. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. That smile. The way it appeared without my own movement, like my reflection had its own intentions, its own emotions that didn't belong to me. And the more I tried to convince myself it was nothing, the more I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. By the end of the day, I was exhausted, mentally drained from overanalyzing every glance, every twitch. I'd sit on the bed, trying not to look directly at the mirror, but it was like gravity. It pulled my attention back, again and again. Every time I told myself this is the last time I would check, but every time I'd catch something new. A fleeting expression, a subtle difference in posture, a movement I couldn't explain. That night, it went too far. I was lying in bed, the room quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. I was staring at the ceiling, fighting sleep, when I heard a creak. It wasn't loud, but in the silence, it sounded like someone stepping across the floorboards. My eyes snapped to the mirror instinctively. It stood across from the bed, reflecting the dimly lit room. Everything looked normal, no movement, nothing out of place. But then I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. My reflection was sitting up, even though I was lying down. She was there, her head slightly tilted, looking directly at me, that same faint smirk playing on her lips. The expression said everything. She was done hiding. I shot up, a shiver running down my spine, and for a split second, my reflection hesitated before copying my movement, as if it had to decide what to do next. I felt the chill of realization. This wasn't just a trick of the mind, not some fragment of my imagination. She was separate, something else entirely. I jumped out of bed, almost tripping over my own feet as I backed away from the mirror. She stayed seated, her eyes locked onto mine, unbothered, that smirk widening into something more sinister. Panic took over. I rushed to the mirror, adrenaline making my hands shake as I grabbed the frame. I needed to end this, to get rid of her, to smash that smug look off her face. The brass frame felt ice cold, almost biting against my skin as I dragged the mirror off the dresser, barely managing to keep my grip. I pulled it away from the wall, the weight of it threatening to tip me over. Suddenly, the air in the room seemed to change, a heavy pressure building, like the world was watching, waiting. My reflection still wasn't moving. She just sat there, her eyes following me, her smile growing wider, almost like she was daring me to do it. I lifted the mirror with all my strength. I stumbled back, the mirror almost slipping out of my grasp, but I used all the force I could muster to hurl it toward the floor. The glass shattered, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot, shards scattering everywhere. For a split second, everything felt still, like the world had paused to take a breath. Then, the air seemed to move again, a soft rush, almost like a sigh. I stood there, panting, staring at the shards on the floor. My reflection lay in pieces, a dozen fractured versions of myself, each with wide, terrified eyes. The smile was gone, replaced by a look of shock. Suddenly, the room darkened, and the air grew colder. I felt something behind me, a presence. I turned, my heart pounding, and watched as shadows began to swirl around the empty frame of the mirror. They emerged slowly, like ink spreading through water, forming a shape that twisted and expanded. The entity rose from the shards, a grotesque and shadowy version of my reflection, her form flickering like a nightmare barely tethered to reality. Her body was elongated and shifting, her features twisted and wrong, too many joints, too long limbs. She crawled over the shards, the jagged pieces cutting through her shadowy form without a sound, her dark eyes locking onto mine as she got closer, until she was just an inch from my face. I could barely breathe. Her eyes were empty, like twin voids, and her mouth slowly parted, a dark hollow that stretched impossibly wide. Then came the shadows, pouring out of her mouth, inky black tendrils that wrapped around me. They were cold, numbing my skin as they twisted around my arms and legs. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come. She leaned closer, until her forehead nearly touched mine, and with a final shuddering exhale, she poured herself into my mouth. The cold was overwhelming, numbing my senses, until I could feel her crawling through my veins, the shadows spreading, taking root inside me. I felt memories, thoughts, emotions that weren't my own, things I couldn't even comprehend. Visions of dark places, twisted laughter, an endless void that pulled at me from the inside. I stood there, my heartbeat slowing, my panic fading away. An unnatural silence enveloped me, as though the entire world had hushed in anticipation. The fear drained out of me, replaced by a stillness that felt alien. My breathing levelled, the cold replaced with a warmth spreading through my limbs. I blinked and the terror was gone. In its place was calm, an unnatural, warm calm, and a smile. I could feel my lips curling, that same wicked smile that had taunted me from the other side of the mirror. I turned to the door, stepping over the shattered pieces of glass, without so much as a flinch. I left the house in silence, my bare feet stepping across the cold floor and into the pouring rain. The wind howled, but I heard none of it. I walked out into the storm, my expression never changing, that smile etched on my face. I was free. And I wasn't alone.